Sometimes the hardest choice is showing mercy to the one who destroyed your world. For 30 years, old Brynja had lived alone in her mountain home, haunted by the memory of her family's death at Viking hands. When the most feared war chief in Norway collapsed bleeding at her door, she recognized him instantly. This was Stenr Ironside, the man whose blade had taken everything she loved. Her healer's heart told her to save him. Her wounded soul whispered for revenge. She chose mercy and nursed him back to health with ancient herbs and gentle care. But at dawn, the sound of marching feet shattered the mountain silence. 200 armed warriors surrounded her home. They hadn't come for their fallen leader, they had come for her. The old woman who had saved their enemy now faced accusations of witchcraft and treason. What secret did this simple healer possess that an entire clan would risk war to claim? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind carried the scent of snow and old sorrows across the high fjell, where Brynja's steading sat like a watchful eye, overlooking the narrow pass. 30 winters had come and gone, since that terrible spring when her world had burned, yet she could still hear the screams echoing off these same mountain walls. Still smell the smoke that had turned her husband's forge into a funeral pyre. Still see little Eric's wooden sword, carved by his father's loving hands, abandoned in the bloody mud where her 6-year-old son had fallen, trying to protect his baby sister. That had been Stenr Ironside's work. The great war chief who now lay unconscious in her bed, his massive frame dwarfing her simple wooden furniture like a wolf among sheep. His breathing came in shallow, labored gasps, each exhale a reminder of how easily death could claim even the mightiest of men. The broken war axe beside him, an heirloom weapon split clean through the blade during his recent defeat, spoke of battles lost and honor questioned. Brynja moved with practiced quiet around her small home, grinding willow bark for fever and preparing poultices that had saved countless lives over the decades. Her healing pouch, worn leather soft as silk from years of use, contained herbs that bridged the gap between life and death. Each plant had been gathered at the proper moon, dried with ancient songs, and blessed with words her own mother had whispered before the villagers had driven her away for practicing the old ways. The irony was not lost on her. Here was the destroyer of her family, helpless as a newborn babe, dependent on the very hands that had once prepared her children for burial. She had recognized him instantly, despite the grey threading his beard and the deep lines carved by years of warfare. Some faces, once seen, never fade from memory, especially when they belong to the man who changed everything. Stenr Ironside. Even his name carried weight in these northern lands. For 15 years, he had been the most feared war chief between the mountains and the sea, leading raids that had brought wealth and glory to his clan while striking terror into the hearts of his enemies. His ships had carried dragon prows across storm-tossed waters to distant shores. His war band had been the stuff of saga and nightmare both. But glory was a fickle mistress, and time had not been kind to the great warrior. 3 seasons past, rival clans had begun to challenge his authority. Younger men whispered that his sword arm had grown weak, that his strategic mind had dulled with age. The great Stenr Ironside, they said, was becoming just another old man clinging to past victories. The ambush at the northern pass had proven them right, or so it would seem to those who had not witnessed the betrayal firsthand. Brynja knew the signs of treachery when she saw them. The wounds on Stenr's back spoke of trusted allies turning their blades against him. The precise nature of his injuries suggested coordination, planning. This had not been a fair fight between honorable enemies, but a calculated assassination attempt by those who had once sworn oaths of loyalty. Yet somehow, wounded unto death and bleeding into the snow, the old wolf had crawled through the mountain passes to collapse at her door. Not at the hall of some wealthy jarl who might have sheltered him for political gain, not at the shrine of some powerful god where he might have sought divine intervention. He had come to her, the humble healer whose family his blade had destroyed 3 decades past. The strangest part was that she had been expecting him, not him specifically perhaps, but someone like him. For weeks now, her dreams had been filled with visions of blood in the snow, of ancient debts coming due, of choices that would echo through generations. Her mother's gift, the sight that had made their family both blessed and cursed, had never fully left her, though she had tried to bury it beneath years of practical healing work. Brynja's steading reflected a life built from the ashes of tragedy. Every beam had been raised by her own hands. Every stone had been placed with deliberate care. The herb garden that fed her healing practice grew in soil enriched by compost she had turned herself. She had learned to be self-sufficient because the alternative was death, and death was a luxury she could not afford when so many depended on her skills. The villagers in the valley below knew her as a healer who asked no questions and turned no one away. Pregnant women climbed the mountain path, seeking her knowledge of childbirth. Warriors bore their wounded to her door after raids and skirmishes. Even the occasional outlaw or exile found sanctuary here, for Brynja's reputation extended far beyond her medical abilities. She was known as someone who honored the old laws, the sacred duties that transcended clan loyalties and personal grievances. But they did not know the full truth of what she was, could not suspect the bloodline that ran in her veins or the powers that her mother's persecution had forced her to hide. The common folk saw only a skilled healer, perhaps a bit touched by the old magic, but nothing more than that. They had no idea that they sought aid from one of the last daughters of the ancient royal line, a woman whose very existence posed a threat to the current order. The sound of hoofbeats on the mountain path had broken the pre-dawn silence like thunder, pulling Brynja from her vigil beside Stenr's bed. 200 mounted warriors. She had counted them through her small window as they surrounded her home in the grey light before sunrise. Their leader, Magnus Bloodaxe, sat his horse like a man born to war, his silver arm ring catching the first rays of dawn as he raised his hand to halt his men. Magnus. She knew that face as well, though for different reasons than Stenr's. Where the war chief represented personal loss, Magnus represented something far more dangerous, the man who knew exactly who she was and what her existence meant to his own ambitions. The warriors wore the colors of 3 different clans, their shields bearing the marks of old alliances and older grudges. This was not a simple raiding party or even a rescue mission. This was a carefully orchestrated political maneuver, and Brynja found herself at its center, whether she wished it or not. Through the thin wooden walls of her home, she could hear Stenr stirring, his warrior's instincts awakening even before his mind fully grasped the situation. Soon he would demand answers. Soon he would learn why a simple mountain healer had become the prize in a game that stretched back generations. But first, there was the immediate matter of survival. Magnus would not simply ride away empty-handed, not after bringing such a force to her doorstep. Whatever happened in the next few hours would determine not just her fate, but the direction of an entire kingdom that had forgotten it, still had living heirs to ancient thrones. Brynja touched the leather pouch at her side, feeling the herbs within that had sustained her through 3 decades of hiding. Today, she suspected, her long exile was about to end one way or another. The carved runestone landed with a dull thud against Brynja's door, its message as clear as a death sentence. She did not need to read the ancient symbols to understand their meaning. Magnus Bloodaxe had made his accusations formal. By the old laws, she now stood charged with witchcraft and treason, crimes punishable by fire and blade. Stenr's eyes opened as the sound echoed through the small dwelling. For a moment, confusion clouded his weathered features as consciousness returned in fragments, the unfamiliar ceiling, the scent of healing herbs, the distant murmur of many voices outside. Then, awareness struck him like a physical blow, and his hand moved instinctively toward where his weapon should have been. Your axe is broken, Brynja said quietly, not turning from the window where she watched Magnus's men position themselves in a wide circle around her home. Snapped clean through during whatever betrayal sent you crawling to my door. Stenr struggled to sit up, his massive frame protesting the movement. The bandages around his torso were stained with old blood, but they held firm. His left shoulder bore the careful stitching that spoke of a healer's patient work, and his fever had broken sometime during the night. He was alive impossibly, miraculously alive, when by all rights he should have died in the snow. You, he whispered, his voice hoarse with disbelief. You're the woman from Ironhold Valley, the one whose family you butchered 30 years past. Brynja's tone carried no anger, only the weight of undeniable truth. Whose husband's forge you burned, whose children you left for the ravens. The silence stretched between them like a chasm filled with ghosts. Stenr's memories of that raid had blurred over the decades, lost among countless other battles and conquests. But this face, lined now with years of hard living, brought it all rushing back. The young mother screaming over her fallen children, the way she had looked at him with such pure hatred that it had burned itself into his dreams. Why? The word escaped him before he could stop it, carrying layers of meaning that neither fully understood. Why had she saved him? Why had she not left him to die as he deserved? Why had she shown mercy to the one who had shown her none? Before Brynja could answer, Magnus's voice boomed across the mountain air, his words carrying the formal weight of clan law and ancient tradition. Brynja, daughter of shadows, keeper of forbidden arts, you stand accused before the assembled clans of practicing witchcraft, of consorting with enemies of the realm, and of treason against the natural order. By your own actions you have revealed yourself as a threat to all decent folk. Come forth and face judgment. Stenr's warrior instincts, honed by decades of conflict, immediately assessed the tactical situation. The voices outside belonged to far more men than any simple pursuit party would require. This was a small army, and armies were not raised to capture elderly healers unless those healers possessed something worth the risk of war. "What aren't you telling me?" he demanded, his voice gaining strength as his body remembered its purpose. "No clan leader brings 200 men to arrest a herb woman. What power do you hold that Magnus Bloodaxe would risk so much to claim?" Brynja's hand moved to the small wooden chest beside her bed, its contents hidden but clearly precious to her. "Some secrets are better left buried," she said softly. "Some truths bring nothing but suffering to those who learn them." "The time for secrets has passed," Stenr replied, struggling to his feet despite the pain that lanced through his wounded body. "Whatever game is being played here, I'm already a piece on the board. The least you can do is tell me the rules." Outside, Magnus was growing impatient. The sound of weapons being drawn carried clearly through the thin walls, accompanied by the nervous stamping of horses and the low murmur of men preparing for violence. Time was running short, and decisions made in the next few moments would determine whether anyone left this mountain alive. Brynja moved away from the window and knelt beside the wooden chest. Her fingers traced intricate carvings that seemed to shift and dance in the flickering firelight protective runes that few in these lands could still read, let alone craft with such skill. The chest opened with a soft click that seemed to echo with the weight of years. "My mother was Sigrid the Farseer," she said quietly, her words falling into the silence like stones into still water. "Daughter of Thorvald the Wise, last legitimate king of these northern lands before the clan wars tore the realm apart." Stenr's blood turned to ice in his veins, royal blood, the one thing that could topple kings and remake kingdoms, the one secret worth killing for and dying to protect. Suddenly, everything made terrible sense. The pursuit, the accusations, the army at her door. "Magnus knows," Brynja continued, lifting a small object wrapped in ancient silk from within the chest. "He has always known. His family served mine in the old days, before greed and ambition poisoned their loyalty. He thinks to use me as his path to power, to legitimize his claim to rule through ancient bloodlines and forgotten oaths. The object in her hands was a ring, not just any ring, but the royal seal of her grandfather's line. Even in the dim light, Stenr could see the way it seemed to pulse with an inner fire, the gold worked with skills lost to this age. Such artifacts were not mere jewelry, but symbols of divine right, recognized by gods and men alike as marks of true kingship. "I never wanted the throne," Brynja said, her voice thick with old pain. "I only wanted to live quietly, to use my gifts to heal rather than to rule. But wanting and having are different things, and the blood in your veins doesn't care about your preferences." Stenr stared at the woman before him, no longer just a healer, no longer simply the victim of his long-ago raid. She was the last daughter of kings, the living link to a time when these lands had known peace under unified rule. And she was his responsibility now, whether he wanted it or not. The irony was bitter as winter ale. He had spent his life raiding and pillaging, following no law but strength, and no master but his own ambition. Now he found himself sworn to protect the very things he had spent decades destroying: royal blood, ancient honor, the hope of something better than endless warfare. "They'll never let you live," he said finally, stating the obvious truth that hung between them. "Not Magnus, not the other clan leaders, not anyone who benefits from the current chaos. Your very existence threatens their power." "I know." Brynja's acceptance was complete, tinged with the resignation of someone who had carried this burden for far too long. "I've been running from this moment for 30 years. But running ends eventually, and today seems as good a day as any to stop." The pounding on her door began then, heavy fists demanding entry with the force of absolute authority. Magnus would not wait much longer for diplomacy to work. Soon, he would simply take what he wanted by force, and blood would flow on this sacred mountain where her people had once crowned kings. Stenr tested his weight on his wounded leg, grimacing as pain shot through the hastily healed muscle. He was in no condition to fight, but condition had never stopped him before when duty called, and duty was calling now, louder than it ever had in his long life of violence and conquest. "Give me your word," he said urgently, his eyes fixed on the royal seal in her hands. "Swear to me that you'll use that power for something better than what came before. Swear that if you live through this day, you'll try to heal these lands instead of ruling them with blood and iron." Brynja looked up at him with eyes that held the weight of generations. "I swear it by my mother's memory and my children's graves. If I must be queen, I'll be a queen of mercy, not of war." The door exploded inward as Magnus's patience finally reached its end, and the game of kings and healers began in earnest. Magnus' bloodaxe filled the doorway like a storm cloud made flesh, his silver arm ring catching the morning light as he stepped into Brynja's modest home. The ornate band of metal was more than decoration, it was the symbol of his authority, passed down through generations of clan leaders who had carved their power from blood and betrayal. Behind him, a dozen armed warriors crowded into the small space, their weapons drawn but not yet raised in open threat. "So the wolf lives?" Magnus said, his gaze settling on Stenr with a mixture of disappointment and calculation. "I had hoped to find only your corpse here, old friend. It would have made things simpler." Stenr leaned against the wall, his wounded body protesting the effort to remain standing. But his eyes never left Magnus's face, reading the subtle signs of a man who had come too far to turn back now. "Simpler for whom? You always did prefer your victories to come with minimal risk." The insult hung in the air between them, a challenge wrapped in casual words. Magnus's hand moved instinctively toward his sword hilt before stopping, his political mind overruling his warrior's pride. This was not the time for personal satisfaction. Too much depended on the next few moments. "You misunderstand the situation," Magnus said, his voice taking on the formal cadence of clan law. "I'm not here as your enemy, Stenr Ironside. I'm here as the rightful authority in these lands, come to arrest a dangerous criminal who has harbored enemies of the realm." "Criminal?" Brynja's voice carried quiet steel as she rose from beside her treasure chest, the royal seal now hidden within her robes, but its presence changed everything about her bearing. "By what law do you name me criminal, Magnus Odinson? By what right do you bring armed men to sacred ground?" The use of his true patronymic son of Odin, the name his family had claimed for 3 generations, despite lacking any divine blood, struck Magnus like a physical blow. Few alive knew that ancient claim, fewer still would dare speak it with such casual authority. It was a reminder of old oaths and older loyalties that his family had conveniently forgotten in their rise to power. "By the law of necessity," Magnus replied, but uncertainty flickered in his eyes. "By the right of those who keep order in chaotic times. You practice forbidden arts, old woman. Your very presence here corrupts the natural balance." "The natural balance?" Brynja's laugh was soft but bitter. "Is that what you call the endless warfare that has bled these lands dry for 30 years? Is that the order you defend with sword and fire?" Stenr watched the exchange with growing understanding. This was not a simple arrest, but the opening moves of a much larger game. Magnus needed Brynja alive. Her royal blood was useless to him dead, but he also needed to control the narrative, to frame her capture as justice rather than kidnapping. "You know why I'm here," Magnus said finally, abandoning pretense for directness. "You know what you represent and why it cannot be allowed to continue. These lands need strong leadership, not the ghost of failed dynasties." "Strong leadership?" The voice from the doorway belonged to a young woman who stepped into the crowded space with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to command. Astrid Magnusdottir possessed her father's piercing blue eyes, but none of his cruel calculation. Her presence immediately shifted the dynamic in the room, adding an element that Magnus clearly had not anticipated. "Astrid," Magnus said sharply, "you were ordered to remain with the horses." "I was ordered to observe," she corrected, her gaze moving between Brynja and Stenr with open curiosity. "And what I observe is interesting indeed. The great Stenr Ironside, healed by a mountain herb woman, a woman who speaks with the authority of old blood and older wisdom." Stenr studied Magnus's daughter with the eye of a veteran warrior. She was young, perhaps 20 winters, but carried herself with the confidence that came from genuine skill rather than inherited position. Her sword was well used but well maintained, and her stance suggested training that went beyond the ceremonial combat taught to most noble daughters. "You question your father's judgment?" Magnus demanded, his voice carrying the edge of a man whose authority was being challenged on multiple fronts. "I question all judgment," Astrid replied calmly. "It's a useful habit for those who hope to survive in uncertain times, and these times are nothing if not uncertain." Brynja moved slowly toward the center of the room, her healer's instincts reading the tension that crackled between father and daughter like lightning before a storm. Here was another crack in Magnus's carefully constructed plan, dissent within his own family, that could be exploited if handled properly. "Your daughter speaks wisdom," Brynja said, her voice carrying the maternal warmth that had comforted countless patients over the years. "These are indeed uncertain times, full of choices that will echo through generations yet unborn. The question is whether we choose the path of fear or the path of hope." "Pretty words," Magnus sneered, but his confidence was clearly shaken by his daughter's unexpected intervention. "But words don't change the reality of power. You are outnumbered, surrounded, and far from any help. Submit to arrest, and I promise you'll be treated with the dignity your age deserves." "And if I refuse?" Brynja asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "Then my men will take you by force, and the war chief who harbors you will face the consequences of his choices." Stenr straightened, despite the pain that shot through his wounded torso. "The war chief stands where he chooses to stand," he said formally, his voice carrying the weight of oaths sworn and honor defended. And today, I choose to stand with she who showed mercy when she could have shown justice. The declaration hung in the air like a challenge thrown down before gods and men. By the ancient codes that governed their world, Stenr had just declared himself Brynja's champion, bound by honor to defend her regardless of the cost. It was a commitment that could not be taken back, a line drawn that could not be uncrossed. Magnus's face darkened with frustrated rage. You would throw away everything you've built for a woman you barely know, your reputation, your legacy, your very life? I've spent 30 years building a legacy of blood and ash, Stenr replied, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was committing to. Perhaps it's time to build something different. Astrid watched this exchange with fascination, her young mind processing implications that her father seemed blind to. Here was history being made, old patterns breaking down to make room for something new. The legendary Stenr Ironside, choosing mercy over vengeance, protection over profit. It was the kind of transformation that songs would be written about if anyone lived to sing them. Father, she said quietly, perhaps we should reconsider our approach. Surely there's a way to resolve this that doesn't require bloodshed on sacred ground. Magnus whirled on his daughter with barely controlled fury. You forget yourself, girl. This is not a matter for your opinion or your conscience. This is politics, and politics requires hard choices that soft hearts cannot understand. I understand perfectly, Astrid replied, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. I understand that you're about to start a war that will accomplish nothing but adding more graves to our already crowded burial grounds. I understand that you're so focused on grasping power that you've forgotten what power is supposed to serve. The room fell silent as father and daughter faced each other across a gulf that had been years in the making. Behind Magnus, his warriors shifted uncomfortably, caught between loyalty to their leader and the growing realization that this situation was spiraling beyond anyone's control. Brynja watched it all, with the patience of someone who had learned to read the deeper currents of human nature. The seeds of change were already planted in Astrid's questions, in Stenr's transformation, in the very fact that Magnus had been forced to bring an army to capture one old woman. Now it remained to be seen which seeds would take root and which would wither in the harsh soil of ambition and fear. The old loom in the corner of Brynja's home seemed to hum with memory as she moved toward it, her weathered fingers tracing the intricate patterns woven into wood that had been seasoned by generations of women's hands. Her mother's loom, the last tangible connection to a bloodline that stretched back to the founding of these northern kingdoms. Each groove in the worn frame told a story of nights spent weaving by firelight, of secrets passed down through whispered words and careful demonstrations. You want to understand why Magnus fears me so deeply? Brynja asked, her voice carrying the weight of old sorrows as she turned to face Stenr and Astrid. Then let me tell you about my mother, and why the sight of this simple tool would terrify every clan leader from here to the southern fjords. Magnus stepped forward, his hand now resting openly on his sword hilt. Enough of your stories, witch. My patience grows thin, and my men grow restless. Come willingly, or let her speak, father. Astrid's voice cut through his threat like steel through silk. If you're so certain of your righteousness, what harm can her words do? The challenge in his daughter's tone was unmistakable, and Magnus found himself caught between the need to maintain authority and the dangerous precedent of silencing her in front of his men. A wise leader knew when to bend rather than break, and this moment balanced on such a knife's edge. Brynja's hands moved across the loom's surface with practiced reverence, awakening patterns that seemed to shift and dance in the morning light streaming through her small windows. Sigrid the Farseer was the last Volva to serve in the royal court, she began, her voice taking on the cadence of one reciting sacred history. My mother could read the threads of fate as easily as other women read the expressions on their children's faces. Sten leaned against the wall, his warrior's pragmatism warring with a growing sense that he was witnessing something far beyond his understanding. The rational part of his mind dismissed such talk as superstition and elaborate storytelling, but the deeper, older part, the part that remembered childhood tales of gods walking among mortals, recognized the truth that resonated in Brynja's words. The kings of old valued her counsel above gold and steel, Brynja continued, her fingers now moving in complex patterns across the loom's frame. Not because they believed in magic, but because her advice proved sound time after time. She could see the consequences of decisions before they were made, trace the ripples of action across years and generations. "Pretty stories," Magnus said, though his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "But the age of kings is over, and the age of vulva ended with it. These lands are ruled by strength now, not by fairy tales and women's wisdom." Astrid moved closer to the loom, her young eyes wide with fascination. "What happened to her? To your mother?" Brynja's expression grew heavy with old pain. "Fear happened. When the kingdoms fell and the clan wars began, men grew suspicious of any power they could not control or understand. They said she was a threat to the natural order, that her visions gave unfair advantage to those who consulted her. The parallel to her own situation was not lost on anyone in the room. History, it seemed, had an endless appetite for repetition. "They burned her," Brynja said simply, her voice steady despite the enormity of the confession. "Not for any crime she had committed, but for the crime of seeing too clearly. And with her death, they thought they had ended the threat of ancient bloodlines and older wisdom." Stenr's memories stirred, bringing forth fragments of that long-ago raid on Ironhold Valley. He had wondered, even then, why Magnus's father had insisted on such thoroughness in the destruction, why every member of the family had to die, why the very foundations of their home had to be torn apart. Now he understood they had been hunting for survivors, for any trace of the royal line that might one day challenge their rule. "But you survived," he said, the pieces of the puzzle finally beginning to fit together in his mind. "I survived because my mother saw her own death in the flames," Brynja replied. "She sent me away before the soldiers came, gave me a new name and a new life, far from the centers of power. I became just another refugee from the clan wars, another woman learning to heal because so many needed healing." She moved away from the loom and sat on her simple wooden stool, suddenly looking every one of her 60 winters. "For 30 years, I've honored her sacrifice by staying hidden, by helping rather than ruling. But it seems the past has finally caught up with me." Magnus watched this display with growing unease. The old woman's words had a power beyond their mere meaning, and he could see their effect on his daughter's face, on the expressions of his men who crowded near the doorway. Stories like these had toppled dynasties and raised new kings from shepherd boys. They were weapons as dangerous as any sword. "Enough," he said finally, his voice harsh with forced authority. "Whatever you once were, whatever your bloodline might claim, you are nothing now but an obstacle to peace and order. I will not allow ancient superstitions to destabilize what we have built." "What you have built," Astrid said quietly, "is an endless cycle of war and suffering. Perhaps it's time to try building something different." The words fell like stones into still water, creating ripples that spread to touch every person in the small dwelling. Here was the fundamental question that had driven 30 years of conflict, whether strength alone could create lasting peace, or whether peace required something deeper, older, more rooted in the wisdom of generations. Brynja rose from her stool and moved to stand beside Astrid, two women separated by decades, but united by their vision of what could be, rather than acceptance of what was. "Your daughter has the sight," she said to Magnus, her voice gentle but certain. "Not as strong as my mother's gift, perhaps, but clear enough to see the truth you refuse to acknowledge." Magnus's face went white with a rage that was part fury and part fear. "You will not corrupt her with your poison?" he snarled, stepping forward as if to physically separate them. "She is my daughter, heir to my authority, and she will not be turned against me by a mad woman's ravings." But Astrid did not step away. Instead, she stood straighter, her young voice gaining strength as she spoke. "I am my own person, father, with my own eyes and my own mind. And what I see is a world where might has failed to make right, where strength has created only weakness, where the strong prey on the weak until everyone is diminished." The confrontation between father and daughter had reached a point where something had to break. Magnus could feel his carefully laid plans crumbling like walls built on sand, undermined by the very person he had counted on to support his ambitions. Outside, the sound of restless horses and muttering warriors reminded everyone that this private drama was playing out against a larger backdrop of armed conflict. Soon, decisions would have to be made that could not be unmade, and blood would flow to wash away the last remnants of an older, perhaps wiser world. The torn battle standard that Stenr's surviving warriors carried bore witness to loyalty tested by blood and time. The clan banner of the fallen, as his men had come to call it, was more than mere cloth and dyes. It was a record of every battle fought, every comrade lost, every victory bought with the lives of brothers in arms. Now it flew over a dozen mounted warriors who had tracked their wounded chief through treacherous mountain passes, following oaths sworn in better times when the world seemed simpler and honor less complicated. Eric the Bold rode at their head, his scarred face grim with the knowledge of what they would find. Behind him came Thorvald Ironarm, Bjorn the Silent, and 9 other men whose loyalty to Stenr ran deeper than clan politics or personal ambition. They had served with him through 15 campaigns, shared his victories and defeats, and followed him into battles that lesser men would have fled from in terror. But as they crested the final ridge and saw the army surrounding Brynja's steading, even these hardened veterans felt their hearts sink. 200 warriors against 12 odds that would have been laughable in their younger days now seemed like a death sentence written in steel and blood. "What madness is this?" Eric muttered, his weathered hand instinctively checking the security of his sword hilt. Why would Magnus Bloodaxe bring half his clan to capture one old herb woman? "Because she's not just an herb woman," Thorvald replied, his keen eyes taking in the careful positioning of Magnus's forces. "Look at how they're arrayed, not for a simple arrest, but for a siege. They expect resistance, and they expect it to be significant." Inside the small dwelling, Stenr heard the familiar sound of his warband's approach and felt a mixture of relief and dread wash over him. These men had sworn to follow him anywhere, but he had never intended to lead them into a conflict where their only choice was between dishonor and death. Magnus heard it too, his political instincts immediately calculating the new variables that 12 more warriors introduced to an already complex equation. His overwhelming numerical advantage remained, but the arrival of Stenr's loyal men changed the symbolic weight of any violence that might follow. It was one thing to arrest a traitor and her accomplice, quite another to massacre a war chief and his sworn companions on sacred ground. "Call them in," Magnus ordered, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "Let them see their chief's situation and make their own choice between wisdom and futility." Astrid watched her father's face as he spoke, reading the subtle signs of a man whose carefully laid plans were beginning to unravel. She had studied politics at his knee for years, learning to see the currents of power that flowed beneath the surface of formal negotiations. What she saw now was a leader who was beginning to realize that force alone might not be sufficient to achieve his goals. Brynja moved to her small window and looked out at the gathering forces with eyes that had seen too much conflict over too many years. The arrival of Stenr's men meant that the situation was now beyond any simple resolution. Blood would be spilled before the sun reached its zenith, and the only question was how much and whose. "They're good men," she said quietly, her healer's heart already mourning the lives that would likely be lost. "I've tended wounds for some of them over the years. Eric the Bold brought his son to me when fever nearly took the boy. Thorvald's wife sought my help with a difficult childbirth. Stenr struggled to his feet, ignoring the protests of his wounded body. Then you know they'll fight to the death if I ask it of them. The question is whether I have the right to ask. You have the right of a leader to lead, Astrid said, her young voice carrying surprising conviction. But perhaps the greater question is where you choose to lead them toward the old patterns of violence and vengeance, or toward something that might actually heal these wounded lands. Her words carried an echo of ancient wisdom that made even Magnus pause in his calculations. This was not the daughter he had raised to support his ambitions without question, but a young woman who was beginning to forge her own understanding of what leadership should mean. Outside, Eric the Bold called out in the formal language used for parley between armed forces. "Stenr Ironside, your men have come to stand with you, whatever your choice might be. But we would hear from your own lips what cause has brought us to this mountain pass." The traditional words carried weight beyond their simple meaning. By invoking the ancient forms, Eric was acknowledging that this had moved beyond a simple rescue mission into something that might determine the fate of kingdoms. He was also, subtly but unmistakably, placing the choice entirely in Stenr's hands, while making it clear that his war band would honor whatever decision their chief made. Stenr looked around the small dwelling that had become the center of forces much larger than anyone present could fully control. His eyes moved from Brynja, the hidden queen whose very existence challenged the current order, to Astrid, the young woman who seemed to see possibilities that her father's generation had given up on, to Magnus, the ambitious leader whose plans were crumbling under the weight of their own contradictions. "Tell me about the prophecies," he said suddenly to Brynja. His warrior's intuition, sensing that understanding the larger pattern was crucial to making the right choice. "Your mother's gift, what did she see coming?" Brynja's expression grew distant as she reached into memory for words spoken in whispers decades past. She spoke of a time when the old blood would return to heal what the clan wars had broken. She saw a warrior whose heart would turn from conquest to protection, and a healer who would rise from hiding to unite what had been scattered. "Pretty poetry," Magnus said harshly, but his voice lacked conviction. "The ravings of a desperate woman facing death." "Perhaps," Brynja acknowledged, but she also saw the exact manner of her own death, predicted the fall of 3 kings before they died, and warned of the great winter that killed half the livestock in these mountains 5 years past. Her gift was real, whatever you might choose to believe about the rest. Stenr moved slowly toward the door, each step a deliberate choice between the man he had been and the man he might yet become. The banner of his fallen comrades seemed to call to him from outside, reminding him of all the oaths he had sworn and all the blood he had shed in service to a warrior's code that had brought nothing but endless conflict. But Brynja's words had planted seeds of possibility in soil that war had made fertile for change. Perhaps there was another way to honor the dead, not through more death, but through building something worthy of their sacrifice. The sacred stone that marked Brynja's healing well bore inscriptions so ancient that few living could read their meaning, but their intent was clear to anyone who understood the old ways. The healing well's sacred stone had protected this mountain spring for generations beyond count, marking it as neutral ground where even enemies could seek aid without fear of betrayal. Water from this well had saved countless lives over the centuries, its purity enhanced by rituals that connected the physical world to deeper spiritual forces. Magnus stood before the stone now, his political mind warring with superstitions that he had thought long buried. The inscriptions seemed to mock his authority, reminding him that some powers predated clan law and secular rule. To violate sacred ground would mark him as an oath-breaker in the eyes of every warrior who served him, but to honor it might cost him the prize he had spent years maneuvering to claim. "You feel it too," Brynja said quietly, approaching the well with the reverence of one who had tended its sacred waters for 3 decades. "The weight of older laws, older oaths that bind us all, whether we acknowledge them or not. Stenr watched this exchange with growing understanding of the forces at play. His transformation from destroyer to protector was becoming something more than personal redemption. It was part of a larger pattern that stretched back to the very foundations of their world. The Norse understanding of fate and honor demanded that some things be respected regardless of political convenience. Sacred ground or not, Magnus said, but his voice carried less certainty than before. I cannot allow ancient superstitions to override the needs of the present. These lands require strong leadership, not ghost stories and women's mysteries. Astrid knelt beside the well and cupped the clear water in her hands, feeling the strange warmth that marked it as more than ordinary mountain spring. Perhaps the question isn't whether we believe in the old ways, she said thoughtfully, but whether we're wise enough to learn from them. Our strong leadership has given us 30 years of war and suffering. Maybe it's time to try a different kind of strength. The words struck her father like physical blows, each one undermining the foundations of everything he had built his identity upon. Magnus Bloodaxe had risen to power by convincing himself and others that only force could create order, that only the strong deserved to rule. Now, his own daughter was questioning the very assumptions that had driven his life's work. Stenr's men remained mounted in a loose circle around the sacred area, their warriors' code preventing them from violating neutral ground, even as their loyalty demanded they protect their chief. Eric the Bold watched the standoff with the patience of a veteran who had seen too many battles decided by the smallest of details. Something about this situation felt different from the usual clan conflicts, larger, more significant, as if the very foundations of their world were shifting beneath their feet. Chief, Eric called softly, using the old forms that showed respect for sacred ground. Your orders? The question hung in the mountain air like the blade of a suspended sword. Every person present understood that Stenr's answer would determine not just the immediate outcome of this confrontation, but the direction of forces that had been building for decades. This was the moment when history balanced on the edge of choice, when individual decisions would echo through generations. Brynja moved away from the well and approached the sacred stone, her fingers tracing inscriptions that her mother had taught her to read in childhood. The ancient words spoke of healing and wisdom, of the responsibility that came with power, and of the price that must be paid by those who would lead others toward light rather than darkness. The old kings understood something that we have forgotten, she said, her voice carrying the authority of inherited wisdom. They knew that true power comes not from the ability to destroy, but from the wisdom to protect and nurture what is precious. The sacred wells, the healing grounds, the spaces where life conquers death, these were the true treasures of the realm. Magnus felt the ground shifting beneath his carefully constructed political position. Every word Brynja spoke reminded his warriors of older loyalties, deeper obligations than mere clan bonds. He could see the uncertainty growing in their faces, the questions that challenged everything they had been taught about strength and leadership. You speak of protection and nurturing, he said, his voice taking on the edge of desperation. But where were these virtues when the clan wars began? Where was this ancient wisdom when kingdoms fell and strong men carved new realms from the ashes of the old? It was here, Brynja replied simply, gesturing toward the well and the sacred stone, waiting for someone wise enough to choose healing over conquest, mercy over vengeance. It was here, in every act of compassion that survived the darkness, in every healer who tended wounds regardless of which side had inflicted them. Stenr felt the truth of her words resonate in his bones, awakening something that he had thought his years of warfare had killed forever. The part of him that had once believed in something higher than personal glory, something more lasting than victory in battle. His hand moved unconsciously to touch the amulet he wore beneath his battle-worn shirt, a simple piece of carved bone that his mother had given him in childhood, blessed at a well much like this one. The prophecies speak of union, Brynja continued, her voice taking on the cadence of one reciting sacred knowledge. Not the union of conquest, where the strong devour the weak, but the union of choice, where different peoples come together because they see the wisdom of cooperation over conflict. Astrid rose from beside the well, her young face bright with the vision of possibilities that her elders had given up on. "Think of what we could accomplish," she said to her father, her words carrying the passion of youth, unburdened by the cynicism of age. "Think of the songs they would sing about the leaders who chose to heal their lands rather than rule over ruins." But Magnus had gone too far down the path of ambition to turn back now, too far to admit that everything he had fought for might be founded on false assumptions. "Songs are for the dead," he said harshly. "The living require practical solutions to practical problems. And the practical problem before us is simple. There can be only one source of authority in these lands, and it will be strength, not sentiment." The moment of choice had arrived, crystallizing around the ancient stone and the sacred water that had witnessed the rise and fall of kingdoms. In the silence that followed Magnus's declaration, every person present understood that the next words spoken would determine whether this sacred ground would be honored or violated, whether ancient wisdom would be preserved or swept away by the tide of secular ambition. The hidden royal seal that Brynja drew from beneath her robes gleamed with an inner fire that seemed to mock the pale morning light. But it was not the ring itself that transformed the moment, it was the second ring that Magnus pulled from his own hand, its golden surface bearing the mate to Brynja's seal, the twin symbol that could only belong to a rightful regent, sworn to protect the royal line. The silence that followed this revelation was broken only by the sound of weapons being drawn, as Stenr and his men suddenly understood the true scope of the deception that had shaped 30 years of their history. Magnus Bloodaxe was not merely an ambitious clan leader seeking to expand his power. He was the sworn guardian of the last royal heir, the man entrusted with her protection, who had instead engineered her exile and persecution. "You," Stenr breathed, his voice thick with a rage that went beyond personal betrayal to touch the very foundations of honor itself. "You were supposed to guard her. Your family swore sacred oaths to protect the royal bloodline, and instead I saved these lands from civil war," Magnus interrupted, his voice carrying the conviction of a man who had spent decades justifying the unjustifiable to himself. "Do you think I wanted to break my family's ancient oaths? Do you think it was easy to watch a child flee into exile while I told everyone she was dead?" Astrid stared at her father, as if seeing a stranger wearing a familiar face. The silver arm ring that had symbolized his authority now revealed itself as something far more complex, not a symbol of earned leadership, but the mark of a stewardship betrayed, a trust violated for what he claimed was the greater good. "The raid on Ironhold Valley," Brynja said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what was being revealed. "You orchestrated it all, the timing, the targets, even which families were allowed to escape. You made sure no one would look too closely at one missing child among so many dead." Magnus nodded slowly, his face bearing the weight of choices that had haunted him for 3 decades. "Your mother saw her own death in the flames, but she also saw what would happen if you claimed the throne as a child. The clan leaders would have torn you apart, used you as a puppet to legitimize their own ambitions. The realm would have bled itself dry in a succession war that could have lasted generations. So you decided to rule in her place," Stenr said, his warrior's mind now understanding the full scope of Magnus's long game. "Keep her hidden, claim regency over an empty throne, and gradually transition from steward to sovereign. I decided to keep these lands from destroying themselves," Magnus corrected. "And it worked, didn't it? 30 years of clan warfare, yes, but 30 years where the conflicts remained limited, where no one could claim divine right to unite the realm under their banner. 30 years of manageable chaos instead of apocalyptic civil war." Brynja studied the man who had shaped her life through absence and exile, trying to reconcile the protector he claimed to have been with the predator she had always believed him to be. "But now you need me," she said, understanding beginning to dawn. "The clan leaders are growing restless with your authority. They're beginning to ask uncomfortable questions about your legitimacy. You need the royal bloodline to validate your rule before someone else decides to challenge it directly. The realm stands on the edge of true chaos," Magnus admitted, his political mask finally slipping to reveal the desperate man beneath. "Three major clans are positioning for open war. The southern Jarls are talking about independence. Trade has collapsed, and the harvest failures have left thousands hungry and angry. Without legitimate royal authority to unite the kingdom, we face dissolution into warring fragments that will never reunite." Astrid found her voice, though it trembled with the shock of learning that her entire life had been built on a foundation of lies and broken oaths. And what of her choice in this matter? What of the right of the rightful queen to decide her own fate? "Queens don't get to choose their fate any more than common folk do," Magnus said harshly. "Royal blood carries obligations that transcend personal desires. She has a duty to her people that she cannot simply abandon because she prefers the simple life of a healer." The cynicism in his words sparked something in Stenr that had been building since his transformation began. Here was the philosophy that had driven 30 years of conflict, the belief that duty and honor were tools to be manipulated by those clever enough to define them according to their own needs. "And what of your duty?" Sten demanded, rising despite the pain in his wounded body. "What of the oaths your family swore to protect and serve, not to manipulate and control?" Magnus's hand moved to his sword hilt. The old reflexes of a lifetime warrior taking over as political argument gave way to personal challenge. "I have served the realm as best I knew how, and I will not be lectured on duty by a raider who has spent his life serving only his own ambitions." "Perhaps," Stenr replied, his own weapon sliding from its sheath with deadly whisper of steel on leather, "but at least my ambitions were honest. I never claimed to serve anything higher than my own desires for wealth and glory. You, on the other hand, have wrapped your betrayal in the language of service and sacrifice." Brynja stepped between the two men before violence could erupt, her healer's instincts overriding all other considerations. "Enough," she said firmly. "If blood is to be spilled over my fate, let it at least be spilled for the right reasons." She held up the royal seal so that its inscription caught the light, revealing words that few present could read, but all could recognize as carrying the weight of divine authority. "Magnus speaks truly about one thing: the realm does stand on the edge of chaos, but he is wrong about the cure. These lands don't need a puppet queen controlled by ambitious regents. They need a leader who understands that true strength comes from serving rather than ruling." The revelation of Magnus's betrayal had reframed everything, but it had also revealed the true scope of the choice before them. This was no longer simply about one old woman's right to live in peace, but about the future of an entire kingdom and the kind of leadership it would accept. The next few moments would determine whether that future would be built on the foundation of honest service or clever manipulation, whether ancient oaths would be honored or discarded for political convenience. Around the sacred well, the sound of armored men shifting in their saddles reminded everyone that this conversation was taking place in the shadow of potential violence that could consume them all. The time for words was running short, and soon actions would speak louder than any argument about duty, honor, or the proper use of power. Stenr's father's shield bore the dents and scars of 100 battles, its iron rim worn smooth by the grip of 3 generations of warriors who had carried it into combat. The family crest, a stylized wolf's head surrounded by runic inscriptions, had been recarved twice as battle damage threatened to erase the symbols that connected the present to an honorable past. Now, as Stenr lifted it from where his men had carefully preserved it among their gear, the shield seemed to whisper of choices that would echo through generations yet unborn. The approaching thunder of hoofbeats from three directions announced that Magnus's carefully orchestrated political maneuver was about to transform into something far more dangerous and unpredictable. Dust clouds on the horizon spoke of armies converging, not just clan warriors answering their leaders' calls, but the remnants of royal guard units whose loyalty had survived 30 years of exile and uncertainty. "They come for you," Magnus said to Brynja, his voice carrying a mixture of satisfaction and growing concern. "Word has spread faster than I anticipated. Half the realm will be here before nightfall, and every one of them will want to claim you for their own purposes." Eric the Bold raised his battle horn to his lips and sounded the long, mournful note that called warriors to prepare for their final stand. It was a sound that had echoed across countless battlefields, summoning men to face death with courage rather than flee from it in shame. But today, the familiar call carried new meaning, not the promise of glorious victory, but the acceptance of sacrifice for something larger than personal honor. Astrid watched the preparations with eyes that seemed decades older than they had been at dawn. The revelations about her father's true role had shattered her understanding of everything she had believed about leadership and duty. Now she faced the prospect of choosing between the man who had raised her and the vision of what their world could become if guided by wisdom rather than ambition. "There's still time," she said to Magnus, her voice carrying the desperate hope of someone who wanted to believe that even the deepest betrayals could be redeemed. "You could stand with her instead of against her. You could honor the oaths your family swore instead of twisting them to serve your own ends." Magnus looked at his daughter with eyes that held the weight of choices made long ago in different circumstances. "You don't understand the burdens of true leadership," he said quietly. "The compromises that must be made, the prices that must be paid to prevent greater suffering. I have spent 30 years preventing civil war, and I will not allow sentiment to destroy what I have accomplished." Brynja moved among Stenr's warriors like a healer preparing for battle, checking wounds and dispensing advice that had nothing to do with herbs or bandages. Her words carried the authority of one who had earned respect through service, rather than demanding it through force. To these hardened veterans, she was no longer just the woman their chief had chosen to protect. She was beginning to embody the vision of leadership they had never dared to hope for. "You fight today not for glory or plunder," she told them, her voice carrying to every man present. "You fight for the possibility that these lands might know peace, that children might grow up without the constant fear of war, that strength might be used to protect rather than to conquer." Thorvald Ironarm, the most grizzled of Stendra's veterans, nodded slowly as he tested the edge of his battle-worn sword. "It's been too long since we fought for something worth believing in," he said simply. "Perhaps it's fitting that our last battle should be our most honest." The tactical situation was hopeless by any conventional measure. 12 warriors and 1 wounded war chief against forces that would soon number in the hundreds. But conventional tactics had never accounted for the power of transformation, the strength that came from fighting for something larger than personal survival. Stenr studied the approaches to the sacred ground with the eye of a strategist who had turned impossible odds into legendary victories. The terrain offered some advantages: narrow passes that would limit the effectiveness of superior numbers, high ground that would make every charge costly for attackers. But ultimately, this would not be a battle won through clever positioning or superior tactics. The old stories speak of heroes making their final stands in places like this, he mused, running his fingers along the familiar surface of his father's shield. Sacred ground, where the boundary between the mortal world and something larger grows thin. Brynja's prophetic sight, inherited from her mother's bloodline, showed her fragments of what was to come, images of fire and steel, of choices that would reshape kingdoms, of sacrifices that would purchase redemption. The visions were never complete, never certain, but they carried the weight of possibility that could guide action even in the face of overwhelming odds. "Your mother saw this day," Magnus said, recognizing the distant look in her eyes. She tried to warn me of what my choices would lead to, but I thought I could change the pattern through will and careful planning. I see now that some fates cannot be avoided, only embraced or fled from. The sound of war horns echoing across the mountains announced that the various forces were positioning themselves for what would likely be the final confrontation. 3 armies converging on a single point, each with their own vision of what Brynja's capture or protection would mean for the future of the realm. Astrid drew her sword and tested its balance, her young hands steady despite the magnitude of what they faced. She had trained in the warrior arts as all noble daughters did, but she had never expected to use those skills in defense of ideals that her own father opposed. "I cannot fight against my blood," she said to Magnus, her voice heavy with sorrow but firm with resolve. "But I cannot stand with you in this either. The oaths you have broken, the trust you have betrayed, these things matter more than kinship." Magnus felt the last of his carefully constructed political position crumble as his own daughter chose principle over family loyalty. Everything he had built, every compromise he had made, every betrayal he had justified, all of it was collapsing under the weight of a simple choice between what was expedient and what was right. "Then you choose to die for nothing," he said bitterly. "You choose to throw away your life for the fantasy of a healer queen who will rule through love and wisdom rather than strength and fear." "Perhaps," Astrid replied, taking her position beside Stenr and his warriors, "but I would rather die for something beautiful than live for something ugly." The final preparations continued as the sun climbed toward its zenith, each side knowing that the day would end with either transformation or destruction. Around the sacred well, ancient powers stirred in response to the approaching conflict, as if the very stones remembered older battles fought for similar stakes. Brynja knelt beside the healing well's sacred stone and placed her hands upon its weathered surface, feeling the connection to generations of healers and queens who had drawn strength from this place in times of crisis. Her mother's voice seemed to whisper from the water itself, offering guidance that transcended the immediate tactical situation. The choice before them was no longer about winning or losing in any conventional sense. It was about what kind of future they would purchase with their sacrifice, what legacy they would leave for generations who might learn from their example. In the distance, the sound of approaching armies grew louder, but here at the sacred well, time seemed suspended as heroes prepared to write the final chapter of their stories in letters of steel and blood. The battle horn of kings sounded across the mountainside with a voice that had not been heard for 30 years, its deep bronze note carrying the authority of divine right and ancient bloodlines. Brynja held the instrument with reverence. Its weight, speaking of ceremonies where her ancestors had been crowned and sworn to sacred duties that transcended personal ambition. The horn's call was both declaration and challenge, announcing that the true heir to these lands was ready to claim her birthright, not through conquest, but through the willing service of those who believed in something higher than mere strength. Magnus felt the sound cut through him like a blade, recognizing the instrument from childhood stories his grandmother had told about the old kings and their regalia. He had thought all such artifacts lost or destroyed in the chaos that followed the kingdom's fall, but here was proof that some things endure beyond the reach of political manipulation. The horn's call was a summons that reached deeper than clan loyalty or personal interest, touching the part of men's souls that yearned for legitimate authority and righteous purpose. "She cannot," Magnus breathed, watching as warriors from all 3 approaching armies began to slow their advance, uncertainty replacing the aggressive certainty that had driven them up the mountain passes. "The blood alone doesn't grant her the right. There are rituals, ceremonies, oaths that must be sworn before gods and witnesses. The blood grants her the right to try," Stenr replied, his father's shield raised as enemy arrows began to fall among the defenders. "And the trying grants us the right to believe that something better than this endless warfare might be possible." Astrid moved with the fluid grace of a warrior born, her swordwork demonstrating years of training that went far beyond ceremonial combat. She had positioned herself to guard Brynja's left flank, her young body a barrier between the healer queen and Magnus's advancing soldiers. The irony was not lost on anyone present. The clan leader's own daughter had become his most dangerous opponent. Her intimate knowledge of his tactics and strategies now turned against him. Eric the Bold and his companions formed a defensive circle around the sacred well, their weathered faces grim with the knowledge that this would be their final stand, but determined to make it worthy of the songs that might be sung about it in years to come. These were men who had spent their lives in service to a warrior's code, but who now found themselves fighting for something that transcended personal glory or material gain. The first wave of Magnus's assault came with the measured precision of soldiers who had trained together for years, their shield wall advancing steadily despite the difficult terrain. But as they drew closer to the sacred ground, something unprecedented happened. Individual warriors began to falter, their commitment wavering as the full implications of what they were being asked to do became clear. "Stand fast." Magnus roared, his own sword drawn as he struggled to maintain control over men whose loyalty was being tested by forces they barely understood. "She is a pretender, a witch who seeks to corrupt your minds with false promises and ancient superstitions." But his words carried less power than they once had. Undermined by the presence of the battle horn of kings and the growing recognition among his warriors that they were being asked to spill blood on sacred ground for purposes that had more to do with their leaders' ambitions than the undermined realm's welfare. Brynja's voice rose above the clash of weapons, carrying words in the old tongue that few present could translate, but all could feel in their bones. She was invoking the ancient protections that surrounded places of healing, calling upon powers that predated clan warfare and secular authority. The very air seemed to thicken with presence, as if the spirits of long-dead kings were gathering to witness this moment of choice. Stenr found himself fighting with a clarity and purpose that he had not experienced in decades, his movements guided by something deeper than tactical training or warrior's instinct. Each blow he struck was not aimed at conquest or personal glory, but in defense of an idea, the possibility that strength could serve wisdom rather than the other way around. The supernatural elements that had been building throughout the conflict began to manifest more directly as the battle intensified. Warriors on both sides reported seeing figures from legend fighting among them, ancient heroes whose loyalties lay not with any living clan, but with the eternal principles of honor and justice. Whether these visions were real or born from the intensity of the moment mattered less than their effect on those who witnessed them. Magnus pressed his attack with increasing desperation, recognizing that his political position would not survive defeat here. Everything he had built over 30 years of careful maneuvering would crumble if Brynja succeeded in establishing her legitimacy through trial by combat. But his men were fighting with diminishing enthusiasm, their hearts no longer fully committed to a cause that required them to violate sacred laws and ancient customs. The tide of battle shifted with each passing moment, not through any single decisive action, but through the accumulation of small choices made by individual warriors faced with conflicting loyalties. Some of Magnus's men began to lower their weapons, unwilling to continue fighting on ground that their ancestors had declared inviolate. Others pressed forward with redoubled fury, committed to their leader regardless of the spiritual implications. Thorvald Ironarm fell, defending the approach to the well, his sacrifice buying precious moments for the defenders while inspiring his companions to even greater acts of courage. His death was mourned even by some of Magnus's warriors, who recognized that a good man had died for principles that deserved respect even from his enemies. As the sun reached its zenith, the battle entered its most crucial phase. Brynja continued to sound the battle horn of kings at intervals, each note seeming to strengthen her supporters while weakening the resolve of those who fought against her. The ancient instrument was proving to be as powerful as any weapon, its call reaching into the hearts of men and demanding that they choose between expedience and righteousness. The crown of thorns that Brynja wore was woven from healing herbs rather than precious metals, mountain sage for wisdom, white willow for strength, and meadowsweet for hope. She had crafted it herself during the lull in battle, her fingers working with the same careful precision that had saved countless lives over the decades. This makeshift diadem spoke to a different understanding of leadership, one that valued service over dominance and healing over conquest. Magnus faced Stenr across a circle of fallen warriors, both men breathing hard from the exertion of combat, but driven by purposes that transcended mere physical struggle. Around them, the battle had evolved into something more complex than simple warfare. Individual warriors were making choices based on their own understanding of honor and duty, rather than following orders from distant commanders. "You could have been great," Magnus said, his sword raised but his voice carrying genuine regret. "We could have rebuilt these lands together, created an empire that would have lasted centuries. Instead, you choose to die for a woman's fantasy of ruling through kindness." "Perhaps," Sten replied, adjusting his grip on his father's shield as he prepared for what would likely be his final combat. "But I've spent enough years building monuments to my own ambition. Today I choose to build something that might outlast us both." The confrontation between the two men had drawn the attention of warriors from both sides, creating an impromptu circle of witnesses to what everyone recognized as a decisive moment. In the Norse tradition, single combat between champions could resolve conflicts that armies had failed to settle, lending legitimacy to outcomes that might otherwise be disputed for generations. Astrid moved through the battlefield with purpose beyond simple warfare, her sword work precise, but her true mission focused on uniting the younger warriors who had grown weary of their elders' endless conflicts. Her voice carried across the chaos, calling upon men and women of her generation to choose the future they wanted rather than accepting the one their parents had created through decades of violence. "Look around you," she called to a group of Magnus's warriors who had stopped fighting to listen. "Look at what 30 years of strong leadership has given us. Graves filled with friends and brothers, fields turned to wasteland by constant warfare, children who know no songs except battle hymns. Is this the legacy we want to leave?" Her words found fertile ground among fighters who had begun to question whether their sacrifices served any purpose beyond perpetuating the very conflicts that had claimed so many lives. These were not cowards or weaklings, but experienced warriors who had earned the right to judge whether their battles served worthwhile causes. Brynja's choice in the climactic moment came not through violence, but through an act of healing that demonstrated her understanding of true power. When Magnus stumbled during his duel with Stenr, his guard dropping as exhaustion and doubt finally overcame his warrior's training, she could have allowed his death to solve her political problems cleanly and permanently. Instead, she stepped forward and placed herself between the two men, her hands raised not in surrender but in the universal gesture of one who sought to preserve life rather than destroy it. The crown of thorns seemed to glow with inner light as she spoke words that carried the authority of generations. "Enough blood has been spilled in my name," she declared, her voice carrying across the battlefield with surprising power. "If I am to be queen, let it be a queen who breaks the cycle of vengeance rather than perpetuating it. Magnus Odinson, you have served these lands as best you knew how, but the time has come to serve them differently." The offer of mercy, where revenge would have been justified, transformed the moment completely. Warriors who had been prepared to fight to the death found themselves witnessing something unprecedented. A leader who chose to heal rather than punish, to unite rather than divide. Magnus stared at the woman he had spent 30 years trying to control, seeing for perhaps the first time the true source of the power he had feared. It was not the authority of bloodline or the strength of armies, but the far more dangerous force of moral leadership, the ability to inspire others to become better than they had imagined possible. The broader political implications resolved themselves through this single act of transformation. When faced with a leader who valued mercy over victory, many of Magnus's followers found their loyalty shifting not through coercion, but through genuine conversion to a different understanding of what strength could accomplish. The supernatural elements that had manifested throughout the battle reached their climax, as ancient prophecies fulfilled themselves through the choices of mortal participants. The spirits of past rulers seemed to nod approval as Brynja demonstrated that she had learned the lessons they had died, trying to teach that true power served life rather than death, creation rather than destruction. As the immediate fighting ended, the mountain fell silent, except for the sound of men and women laying down their weapons and beginning the difficult work of treating wounds and honoring the dead. The crown of thorns had proven more powerful than any weapon, its simple message of leadership through service resonating with hearts that had grown weary of following strength alone. The foundation for a new kind of kingdom had been laid not in conquest, but in the recognition that some things were worth preserving, worth healing, worth building, rather than tearing down. Whether that foundation would prove strong enough to support lasting peace remained to be seen, but for the first time in 30 years, the possibility seemed real rather than merely wishful thinking. The new settlement's foundation stone bore no royal crests or clan markings, only the simple carving of intertwined hands, one offering aid, another accepting it. Brynja had chosen this design herself, working alongside former enemies to create something that represented unity, forged through choice rather than conquest. The cornerstone was made from stones gathered by warriors who had once fought against each other, their labor a testament to the possibility that former adversaries could build together what none could achieve alone. 6 months had passed since the battle at the Sacred Well, and the changes wrought that day continued to ripple outward through lands that had known only conflict for a generation. The settlement, growing around the healing spring, represented something unprecedented in the northern kingdoms, a community founded not on the dominance of the strong over the weak, but on the recognition that strength could serve purposes larger than personal ambition. Brynja moved through the construction site with the same careful attention she had once devoted to her herb garden, her eyes noting progress and problems with the practiced gaze of someone accustomed to nurturing growth. She wore no crown save the simple circlet of woven grass that the children had made for her, preferring symbols that spoke of life and renewal rather than conquest and domination. The model of leadership she had established drew visitors from across the known world, jarls and kings who came expecting to find either weakness they could exploit or secrets they could steal, only to discover something that challenged their fundamental assumptions about power. Many left unchanged, but some carried home seeds of transformation that would grow in their own lands according to local soil and climate. Stenr stood beside the foundation stone, his scarred hands steady as he guided younger men in the proper placement of supporting timbers. The transformation from destroyer to protector had deepened over the months, his warrior's skills now channeled toward building rather than breaking. His reputation had evolved as well, no longer the feared raider Stenr Ironside, but Stenr the Builder, whose greatest victories were measured in homes razed and communities defended rather than enemies slain. "You've created something remarkable here," said the visiting emissary from the southern kingdoms, his voice carrying genuine admiration mixed with puzzlement. "But how do you maintain order without the threat of force? How do you prevent the strong from simply taking what they want from the weak?" Brynja smiled as she watched Astrid mediating a dispute between two craftsmen, the young woman's natural authority drawing even hardened veterans to accept her judgments. "We don't prevent strength from serving selfish ends," she replied. "We simply offer a better use for it. When people see that their strength can build something larger than themselves, many choose that path over the loneliness of pure self-interest." The relationship between Brynja and Stenr had evolved into something that transcended simple categories of alliance or romance. They were partners in the deepest sense, two people whose different gifts complemented each other in service to purposes neither could achieve alone. Their bond was built on respect, earned through shared struggle, understanding forged through honest confrontation with their own past failures. Magnus's exile had been voluntary, his recognition that he could not serve the new order he had inadvertently helped create. But his letters arrived regularly, filled with observations from distant lands and careful analysis of political developments that might threaten the fragile peace they had built. Even in exile he served the realm, his strategic mind finding new channels for the devotion he had always claimed but never properly expressed. Astrid had emerged as the bridge between old traditions and new possibilities. Her leadership style, combining the decisiveness that her generation had inherited from their warrior parents with a wisdom that prioritized long-term healing over short-term victory. She commanded respect through competence rather than fear, proving that strength could be measured in problems solved rather than enemies defeated. The broader impact of their experiment extended far beyond the boundaries of the new settlement. Trade routes that had been disrupted by constant warfare began to function again as merchants discovered they could travel safely through lands where disputes were settled through negotiation rather than sword combat. Harvests improved as farmers could plan for futures that extended beyond the next raiding season. The foundation stone itself had become a pilgrimage site, drawing visitors who came not to worship, but to witness proof that alternatives to endless conflict were possible. Some came seeking healing from physical ailments, others hoping to cure wounds of the spirit that years of warfare had inflicted. All left carrying stories that would plant seeds of change in their home communities. The lessons learned from the transformation were not universally applicable. What worked in one place and time might fail elsewhere under different circumstances. But the fundamental principle had proven sound, that leadership based on service rather than domination could create stability more lasting than any achieved through force alone. As winter approached and the construction season drew toward its close, Brynja stood once again beside the sacred well, where everything had changed. The crown of thorns she had worn during the battle had long since withered and been buried, but new growth had emerged from the soil it had enriched. The future remained uncertain, filled with challenges that would test the foundations they had laid, but for the first time in decades, those challenges would be met by people who believed that hope was stronger than fear, that building was more satisfying than destroying. The new settlement's foundation stone would endure long after its creators had passed into memory, a reminder that enemies could become allies, that strength could serve mercy, and that sometimes the hardest choice, showing compassion to those who had caused great harm, opened doors to futures that would otherwise remain forever closed. In a world where such lessons were rare and precious, the cornerstone stood as proof that transformation, though difficult, was always possible for those brave enough to choose it.